Chapter 3 High School. To understand my high school years, I must first look back at the day I graduated middle school. It was the moment the seeds of my wandering were first sown, though I didn't recognize them at the time. Having held the top rank throughout middle school, I expected to graduate as valedictorian. It didn't happen. Instead, I was placed in sixth. The reason was a cold systemic injustice. I had been docked marks for outdoor activities, classes I was never permitted to join. There was no alternative assignment, no substitutionary exam. They simply handed me a 50% score for activities I was forced to sit out. I was more than upset. I was outraged, felt deceived, and discriminated against. If I was given a chance to do anything else in the form of something I could do, a paper exam or even arm wrestling, for example, I wouldn't have been that much upset. They just had me sit in the classroom, saying there's nothing they could provide instead of the original program, and yet they took off the marks for something I was never given a chance to do. It seemed utterly unfair, even in my young eyes. To my young mind, the logic was insulting. If they were going to penalize me for my body, why give me half marks at all? They were acting ridiculously, even according to their own logic, in my view. It was the first time I truly realized that no amount of intellectual brilliance could overcome the stigma of my disability. The second blow landed on graduation day itself. Though I was in the sixth place, it was still among the top 10 of those graduated in the year, and that meant I had to receive my award on the high platform in front of the entire schoolyard. The stairs leading up were steep and crucially had no handrail. To this day, if anyone asks me what my personal hell would look like, my answer is immediate: a hell made of stairs. That much stairs are pain to me. I had to hold myself up those steps under the heat of the spring sun, my body drenched in sweat by the time I reached the top. As I stood there, taking an award that felt more like a consolation prize, I made a silent, bitter vow: I would never study hard again. As I graduated the middle school, I was again given a chance to choose the high school I would like to go. Here, I made a pivotal mistake. I rejected Isabel Senior High, the sister school of my middle school, for three reasons, and chose another school. First, the new school had an easier access. Of course, the accessibility of Isabel High School was not bad in terms of public transportation, since it was located just behind the middle school. But there was one big catch. Unlike the middle school, the site where the high school was sitting on was the starting point of a mountain. Hence, I would have to climb up a quite steep slope every morning if I went to Isabel High School. The school I chose was located on flat ground, and this was a big merit for me. Second, it was a newly established high school supported by the local government. The government had an ambition to make its new school famous, and therefore, they paid big money and brought a number of well known teachers in the whole nation for the school. Being an ambitious student still, I wanted to have the best education I could have. Lastly, and most stupidly, I did not like the fact that Isabel's schools were missionary schools. I hated the chapel and the system that made me attend church every week, despite that I did not want to. After 3 years of this, I decided I had had enough of Christianity. I chose to walk away from God, not knowing that by doing so, I was walking into the most painful years of my life. Anyway, that's how my high school life began, and everything got twisted from the very beginning. As it was mentioned in the intro, the flat entrance which made me choose the school became the hell of mud every time it rained. The government had ambition for the school, but apparently it didn't have the time or the money to pave the way that led to school. There was no requirement related to any religion, just as I hoped, but there was something worse. There was an exam on every Monday. It was not a full test like a midterm exam or final exam, of course, but it was still an exam, reflected in my grade. Therefore, I had to study during all weekend to get a good mark on each week's exam. The school was truly ambitious, implanting a system which drove its students to become extremely competitive and driven. The teachers were competent indeed, but I could sense that many of them were somewhat unbearable in their character. Last but not least, I was no longer the undisputed number one. I was surrounded by the brightest students from across the city, and my own motivation was crumbling. All in all, the atmosphere of the school was chokingly competitive, while I was gradually losing interest in my studies. Still, I managed to continue the high school life with no big issue until the first half of my first year, at least on the outside. Inside, however, the turmoil and wondering for an answer for my life became worse and worse. Then the day mentioned in the intro came. There was no particular occasion on that day. It just happened in my seemingly endless wandering. Yet it was the only answer I could logically come up with. From then on, I let everything go. I didn't study hard anymore. In fact, I started skipping the school from then on. I simply didn't see the point. What point could be there in going to the school while there was no point in studying? Wasn't a school a place to study? I missed almost half of the school days from my second year. My attendance rate became so bad that the school warned me that I would be penalized if I kept doing that. Still, I kept missing classes or even escaping before a class I hated began, outdoor activities in particular. There was especially one particular class that I hated most: military drilling. Unlike any other outdoor activities, all those who could not join the drilling because of their physical limit, like me, had to sit on the stalls and had to watch other students getting trained. It was not only challenging to my body, sitting under the sun on a hard cement bench, but so humiliating. It felt like being a monkey in a cage, a public spectacle of my own inadequacy. Hence, I always ran away no matter what if there was a drilling. I didn't care for the exams either. Sometimes, if I felt like it, I went back to the studying hard me and got good grades. Other times, I would answer a single question and hand in a blank sheet. The only reason I answered just one question was because they said I would get expelled from the school if I returned a completely blank paper. One of the teachers who cared about me tried to persuade me one time after watching me behaving like that for months. He carefully advised me, "You see, life is not a joke." What he really wanted to say was probably, "You shouldn't live like that, shouldn't consider your life so lightly and throw it away that easily." I snapped back without even blinking my eye. "No, it's not. It's a play. This is the role I was given, and I'm playing it faithfully." The teacher sighed deeply once and left without talking any further. That much I was twisted by bitterness. My rebellious spirit was in its climax during my second year of the high school, thanks to two new factors. One, the teacher in charge of my class in that year was one of the worst teachers I have ever met. He was an English teacher, and he regarded himself very highly, for he could speak English well at the time. He used to talk about how he escaped from North Korea during the Hungnam evacuation. He was one of those many who didn't get on the board of the last ship that departed. There was no ship anymore, and the Chinese army was advancing from behind. As the last stage of the evacuation, all the choppers of the USA started going up in the air. All the people there cried to take them with them, but none was answered, none but him. Among those countless people, he alone cried in English to save him, he said. Then, miraculously, one of the choppers heard him. It lowered itself and pulled him up to the chopper at his call for help in English. Only him, no one else. Well, that was indeed some story, and understandable that he took pride in himself. But the problem was that he was more than just being proud. He was even arrogant and quite inconsiderate towards other people. He guaranteed that I would never get married or even long enough in front of me and my parents when he visited our house as a part of the curriculum. Kids like this would never make it to 20. That's what he said. Moreover, he openly expected a bribe from my parents, knowing my family was wealthy, while he called himself a Christian, an elder in his church. He ignored me in the classroom when my parents paid no bribe, and then treated me as the most special kid when he got one. I tested him once, giving him my field trip money while pretending it was from my mother. The moment the money changed hands, his attitude toward me shifted from neglect to phoning. My disdain for him and for the Christianity he represented was absolute. The second fracture came when it was time to choose a major. I was gifted in the liberal arts. Even my teacher admitted I knew grammar better than he did. But my mother gave me an ultimatum: major in pharmacy, or she wouldn't pay for university. It would be a stable life for me if I studied pharmacy and become a chemist, she said. There was a lady in my neighborhood who had the same disability as me, and she was a pharmacist, running a pharmacy store. Her way of life must have been seen as an ideal one for me in my mother's eyes. Once again, I was furious and felt hopeless. Yet there was no other way since I didn't have money. It was my parents, my mother more exactly, who controlled the money in my house. I chose to major in natural sciences as my mother wanted, and it was much harder than I worried. I had to struggle with maths and science, in which I was not gifted, for hours, and that drove me to the edge of being mad. I know it's contradicting, since I didn't care about studying after that day of my enlightenment. At the same time, however, there was still another part of me that had to be faithful in everything I was given. Hence, I fluctuated quite badly during my second year. One day, I went to school and studied hard even while struggling. On another day, I just took a bus and went wherever I wanted to go. One of my favorite places was a crematorium. It was the last stop of the bus, number 37 at the time. I used to go there, sitting there for hours, watching people turn to ash and hearing the left families mourning. Rich or poor, powerful or weak, beautiful or ugly, we all end as a handful of dust, I thought. So why struggle? I used to write poems as I watched them. There was a poem I wrote titled A Boy's Death after I watched the funeral of a boy, and I remember my literature teacher praised it. It was a repeating of these during the whole year. Yet, even in that one of my darkest hours, God never stopped pursuing me. For some reason, I still went to the church during all those years, although it was only a few times in a year. Probably it was because of the persistent calls and invitations from the teachers and ministers of the church. I confess, I did try to leave the church for good for several times. I went to a Buddhist temple twice to become a monk, and to a convent to become a nun once. Each time I was refused at the door, saying, "No person with disability allowed." The church was the only place that didn't shut the door whether I liked it or not. Then, in a moment of strange pragmatism, I got baptized at the end of my second year while I had no real belief in God or even in His existence. Probably it too was because of strong recommendation from the church. Anyhow, I got baptized, and surprisingly, that breathed in me some kind of more responsibility towards this belief I chose. I thought perhaps I should be more faithful to this belief, since now, according to what they said, I made some kind of progress in this system. I also thought probably I could use some help from this God, if he really exists, for the next year, since it was the final year in my high school. In South Korea, the final year in your high school is extremely important. It is not an exaggeration even if you say it is one of the most important years in your life if you live in South Korea, since you will sit in the college scholastic ability test at the end of that year. That's the year when students give everything they have in their studies because it might decide the rest of their lives literally. You might have heard of it, but the competitiveness and pressure for this exam in South Korea is more than whatever you imagine. In our times, there was a word saying three pass, four fail. It was a short version of you will get through in the test and be able to go to the university you want if you sleep 3 hours per day and study. If you sleep 4 hours, then you will fail. I was about to enter that year of my life. Hence, I needed all kinds of help I could get, even if it meant from this so called God, whom I really didn't know and didn't care. I felt the futility in studies, and yet I could not let go of it totally, not when my CSAT was coming. Hence, I started to attend the early morning prayer meeting with the start of my final year in high school. I went to the prayer meeting at 4 a.m., spent an hour or so there, then came back home briefly to have a breakfast. Then I headed to the school where I stayed and studied from 7 a.m. in the morning until late at night, like 10 p.m. Then I came back home, studied again for an hour or two, and then went to sleep. That was my everyday during my whole final year in the high school. It was no doubt one of the most difficult years of my entire life, a marathon of exhaustion. Studying mainly for math and sciences, in which I was not talented, for more than 16 hours per day itself was hard enough. But there were other factors that made my situation even harder. The worst of them all was no other than my mother. You might remember that she was a very superstitious woman. As I began my final high school year and preparing for the CSAT, she went to a fortune teller again. There, she was told that I was destined to fail because there's a bad luck in terms of studying in my life. Not only she believed it, but she actually told me that over and over again, literally throughout that whole year. What a great encouragement for me who was already going through a hard time. It almost looked like she actually didn't want me to go to university while I chose my path against my own wish and talent, following her choice for me to major in pharmacy. Another factor that added to my hardship was that I didn't have my own room. My parents, especially my mother, worked hard and made quite a fortune. We were able to buy a couple of houses by the time I was in the high school. Yet we used none of it. My parents leased them all to make more money. As a result, all our seven family members, my parents, me, my sister, and two younger brothers, and my grandmother, who joined the family when I was 12, had to live in two rooms altogether. I shared a room with my grandmother, and she hated when I studied until late at night, saying she could not get into sleep because of the light. I then turned off the main light and brought a lamp under my blanket And there, under my blanket, I studied. Or I went to another room next to the kitchen and studied there. This room was not leased, and there was a good reason. It was more like a storage than a room, and most of all, the gases from briquettes used in the kitchen leaked into that room. Traditional Korean houses used the fire from the kitchen to heat the rooms. At that time, we used briquettes in the kitchen all night. I almost got killed from carbon monoxide poisoning while I studied in that room, not once, but twice. Yet I wasn't given my own room or any place to study even after that. It was obvious that no one in our family understood or even tried to understand how much this study meant to me. In spite of all that hardship, I kept pushing myself. I kept studying hard, sleeping no more than 3 hours per day. Yet there was one last problem. I was by no means a strong or healthy person. The amount of study and daily schedule of my life at the time were simply beyond what my weak body could bear, and that problem burst at the end of the year, just a month before the date of CSET. I contracted trachoma, an eye disease that could make me lose my sight forever. I couldn't open my eyes literally. It felt like my eyes were filled with glass. The doctor prohibited me from reading any books whatsoever, saying absolute rest was the only way to recover from the disease. Just a month before CSET. That was the time when everybody else would now study more than ever. Yet I had to put patches on my eyes and just lie down in my house. Oh, how much was that turmoil inside of me when I had to lie down, doing nothing, when my CSET date was coming. My eyes were not fully recovered even on the CSET day in the end, but I could not give up. I went to an acupuncturist on that morning and had all the countless follicles in my upper tarsal conjunctiva burst by pricking each of them with a needle. With blood literally sipping from my eyes, I sat for the most important test of my life. Against all odds, I scored high enough for the city's top university. But the world had one last cruelty for me. Upon trying to enroll, I was told that the College of Pharmacy would not admit the disabled. The reason was, according to their words, because the study includes many experiments in a lab without sitting, and this would be too challenging for those with disabilities. It didn't stop there. They said because I chose the natural science side in the high school, I was barred from applying for any colleges related to liberal arts such as languages, literature, or even social sciences. I was only able to apply for colleges related to natural sciences, while I would not be admitted because of my disability in those colleges. In my anger, I tried another university where a famous female poet I liked graduated, inquiring if I could be admitted there in any college. The returned answer was even worse. They said they did not admit a student with a disability in any of their colleges, saying it might stain their reputation as a good university. It is ridiculous, and there is no university like that in Korea anymore. But that was the reality of the time in the 1970s. They considered having a disabled person among their graduates as a blemish on their reputation. I was furious. I was devastated. More than devastated, in fact. I've been mocked and discriminated against all my life because of my disability, but this was the worst, no doubt. And yet, no one in my family seemed to really care about it. In the case of my mother, she was like, I told you, you're not destined to go to any university. In inexpressible anger and disdain towards this society, this whole world, in fact, I gave up on going to a university. There was nothing I could do either, really. And just like that, the year ended. CSAT is always at the almost end of every year in Korea. A new year, the year 1979, began, and with that, I realized there was no left meaning of life in me anymore. Until then, study was the reason for my life. Studying hard and getting recognized by people, by the world, was the last and only purpose of life I knew, no matter how pitiful it was in my mind. And now, even that pitiful road was shut. There would be no more support for me to study anymore while I didn't go to a college even, and I could not keep studying while there was no more support. Most of all, I was painfully aware of the futility of studying by this time, not just in theory, but through all the painful experiences of mine, including the most recent one. There was nothing left of me anymore. I was not yet 20, and I was finished. Hence, I made a decision. I would give one last year to this so called God, because he was the only reason or being that was stopping me from ending my life with my own hands by this time. That's what they said in the church anyway. Plus, if he was real, then I would really like to have a serious word or two with him about why he made my life this much miserable. Therefore, it was his turn now. If he proves himself as real and tells me why I should keep on living any longer, then I would leave. If he doesn't, either because he doesn't care about me or because he doesn't exist, then I would end this sick life of mine the moment this year ends, the moment the clock strikes 12 a.m. of the first day of the year 1980. I would kill myself. I was finally tired of my life, and therefore the decision was final. I was ready to end my life with the end of that year, unless I was shown a reason, a good reason, to live any longer.